Oh boy, Utena's turning into a car in one of the most famous scenes in all of anime. It's probably an exaggeration. What would you say? Like, I don't know, Goku going Super Saiyan, See You Space Cowboy, probably something from End of Evangelion. But I think this entire scene is so memorable to anybody that's experienced it because it's so avant-garde. It kind of cracks your head open in a real good way. And it's really twofold. The first is a more general kind of novelty aspect of it that we don't normally see. Anime where a person turns into a car. That sounds obvious, duh. But think about it a little bit more and you'll realize that how kind of restrictive we allow ourselves to be in anime or in any type of creative medium, really. The primary advantage of having something that's animated is that you can come up with stuff that you don't actually literally have to do in real life to record it. You can have paprika level nonsense. You can have giant interstellar ship battles. You could have various squiggles on screen reform and recontextualize and become something else entirely. And yet, most of the time we just set our anime in the school settings in the back left corner with a, relatable male protagonist. If you ever have the time, I highly recommend going and watching Yoko Taro's GDC talk, where he brings up the idea of everything that you can do in a video game and contrast that with what we do in video games. So outside of the more database angle of a learned thing of what to expect from visual narrative in an animated medium, there's also this element of breaking the movie's own scale. That is, up until now, we haven't seen anybody transform into a car. That, again, sounds obvious, right? But really, all works of fiction will do this, and even the bad ones, even the mediocre ones. You set up the rules and the expectations and the way you're going to go about telling the story to the viewer or the audience or the reader, and then you don't normally go about breaking those. It's often jarring and upsetting to your reader if you fail to do that. Imagine you've gotten through the intro of the movie Cars and you understand that the cars are thinking like people, they're acting like people, and they can talk and, ambulate in a way that emulates people. But then all of a sudden you'd have a normal ass car where it doesn't talk and it doesn't have a mouth and giant eyes on the windshield and it's not animated. Well, now your audience is going to wonder about that. Like, how does that happen? What's the deal with that? Why doesn't that? Is there some sort of spirit that imbues these cars with the intelligence to talk? And exactly none of that is necessary or relevant or purposeful at all in the story that Cars is trying to tell you, which is why the movie makers at Pixar obviously leave out that type of realistic car. A great example of this, if you've seen it, is in the fourth episode of Aria the Origination, which is, gone on for 30, 40 some odd episodes at that point, and then all of a sudden you see money being exchanged for the first time in the entire series that is about a business. How has that never come up? How do they never get sunburned? How do they never have to go to the bathroom? Because those things aren't relevant for the scope of the story, and they're distracting and unimportant, so they push them behind to better tell the story. That is until that fourth episode where they break it to say something meaningful. And Utena does the same thing here. It sets up a world where people don't turn into cars. Now, we don't have too much trouble understanding that or believing that because normally humans don't turn into cars in our world, and it's hinted at in places that Otri Academy is not literally what you see on screen, or that it's kind of fantastical in a way. I mean, the Academy itself moves around a lot. Up and down aren't always up and down so much. But up until now, the fantasy has been quite limited. Humans breathe air, there's gravity, nobody has a JoJo stand behind them or anything along those lines. And the bits of fantasy that we're given seem to fit within a normal scheme by the way they're presented. Think about it this way. We know Anthe has that giant gash in her chest. We know she has the power to manifest a sword from within that gash. But we're fine with that because all the characters seem to be fine with that. There's enough of a fantasy inherent in Otri Academy that small things like that can probably go unnoticed, and we can still be talking about human beings with relatable problems. The genius here of the car moment is that through a combination of things that we'll talk about, it really breaks the entire scale of not only what's possible or expected in an anime, but what is acceptable in this world of the story that we're being shown. And don't you dare even for a second think that Ikehara is not doing this deliberately. He quite literally calls out your expectation later on in the chase scene. So let's get into it. I don't know that this scene necessarily warrants a breakdown of the shot-by-shot variety, but I think there's a lot of great metaphors that are coming in here. I know you may have this expectation that this is all, also random or crazy, or that Ikuhara is just trying to be wild, and that this finally will be the one part where I'll write it off and say, whoa, this is just nutso, inexplicable, don't have a reading for it. And I think during that first watch through, when you're still in that shock value of the act of turning into a car, that, yeah, you'll probably come out of it with that kind of mindset. But I'm here to tell you that it's quite the opposite. That Utena turning into a car is probably one of the most logical things, thematically of course, to happen during the course of the film. Utena has just overcome the reasons that would keep her in Otori Academy. She has no longer any reason to stay there, except for one, to get Anthy out as well. So after she's just been purified and transformed by her realizations with Toga and her acceptance in there, how could any of us find it surprising when she is then purified and transformed on screen and becomes a vehicle by which Anthy can leave Otori Academy? Look at this shot here. It's a car wash. It would be a completely different symbol if it was a giant metal structure or of a factory. It's a very great metaphor also in that it says that the form is not what's necessary to escape Otori Academy or to leave the idea of the prince. That is very ephemeral and perfunctory. Her clothes get stripped away, her feminine beauty gets stripped away, but the person who is Utena and the very core of her being remains. It's very clearly a shot to show you that yes, this is Utena. And as this all goes on, we have the directionality come back into play, that even though we immediately came up to the Rose Garden on the Heights where Anthy was and where the idea of the prince is kept, we now immediately descend. And look at the final scene of this movie and what we just saw from the elevator descending. Being haughty, being up high, that's not going to solve anything. That's only going to keep you stationary. The real transformation, the movement happens on the ground level, underground level. You have to go down, you have to be humble, you have to fall from grace in order to resolve these issues that are far beneath you. Remember our left and right dichotomy as well. And notice how in these scenes Utena is always positioned to the bottom left of Anthy. That forced descent and forced looking to the left is kind of the push of Utena rejecting Anthy's offer to become the prince. They could have stayed up high, they could have stayed in that stationary Rose Garden prison and been the prince and been the Rose Bride. But because Utena rejected Anthy's offer, now they're descending, now they're forced back down. And that's terrifying to Anthy, who, as we've already established in all the other episodes, feels comfortable or complacent in that space. And again, the music and just the act of having so much motion on screen, or having the motion take up so much of the screen real estate, lets us know as viewers that this is a monumental event. And that actually segues nicely into my kind of last thing I want to say about the transformation sequence in whole, and that's the idea of this as a magical girl transformation sequence. Now, I could very, very easily give you a 25-minute think piece video essay about the purposefulness and meaning behind the magical girl transformation in the genre, but I think it's a much larger topic that deals with the difference between the magical parts of the magical girl and the girl parts of the magical girl. In some way, Hibiki or Duck or Usagi can't handle what's going on in the fantasy aspect, so they have to transform into their alter ego, and then they're able to. The TLDR, and spoiler warning for every magical girl series ever, is that it's actually the girl part that avails them the day. So the act of transforming is adding onto the glamour, onto the responsibilities, onto the power of the magical girl, but in many ways it's kind of a misdirection or independent of the solution, or really the core values that are realized throughout the series. That becoming prettier, stronger, or more powerful is fine, but it doesn't quite mean everything. And it's really just a reflection of the inner strength that they have already within their core values. In this way, I suppose you could consider the earlier transformation sequences from Utena and the rest of the genre as a bit misguided and otherwise complicating and distracting. But on this transformation sequence, we're not transforming to deal with the fantasy evils. We're transforming to deal with Anthy's inner conflict. If you remember back on the dance sequence, I talked about how that is glamorous but is born from this act of grace. That compassion and understanding can create a new fantastical reality. That's exactly what happens in this scene. And it's just as meaningful and transformative and evocative and powerful. And on top of that, it's pretty memorable as well. Let's come back in on this shot right here of the Rose Garden now being a parking garage. You can notice in the background here that there are actually the other cars that come attack Anthe on the road, which would be the other students. And this is clearly the place that that scene with Jury and Mickey earlier took place in. Then we get the reveal of Utena as Car, very clearly pointed to the bottom left and very clearly still exactly Utena. Some general thoughts about the design of the car. It's very much in this F1 or super speedster style. You can tell how much I don't know about cars, so let's stop right there. There are these designs here on the front of the wheel coverings that look like horses with the mane of the exhaust pipes on them. There's two of them, so it kind of gives the impression that they're pulling a chariot almost. Chariot races immediately should conjure the idea of battle or a contest. And with the design of the car being so sleek, we know that there's going to be a high-speed car chase sequence from the design of this car alone. And of course it mirrors the design of Utena being pink and also, very beautiful. But it's got a kind of frailty to it, which is something that we'll see over the course of the race and, is really important to Utena as a character, I think. And just compare it to the other cars that we'll see later on, which all feel more tankier and self-assured in that way. Utena's probably the fastest car that'll get you out of Otri Academy, but she's almost certainly the one that'll put you in the most danger if you choose to ride in her. But to be fair, if Anthe rode in the Wakaba Jeep for this entire chase scene, it would be a whole lot less interesting as a climax. So as the transformation music fades out, literally fades out, we get these kind of staccato strings that are dissonant and harsh. And before anything else happens, before anything else is done, the car starts to go to rust. One of the things I love and hate about Ikahara is that he does these unsubtle things, like flashback the key segment here. Akio's line of a car without its key will go to rust. And it's very quickly revealed that Anthe has the key, the Mark of the Rose, and that she's now changed her mind about leaving for the outside world. Now, just in the last scene, she rejected Utena's proposal to do this exact thing. So what's changed? Well, two things. One, she has the Mark of the Rose now, the key. Two, she's just seen Utena transform into a car. Remember, Utena hadn't shared with Anthe yet why she was able to leave Otri Academy or what had happened with Toga and the problems that she needed to face. She didn't go through that. She didn't talk about it. And we see that they have shared stuff like this in the past with Anthe's trauma. Wouldn't it make sense that Utena would share with Anthe what she came to understand about Toga that allowed her to rise above the idea of the prince in an effort to get Anthe to leave the academy? I think if you don't transform into a car here, that's the scene that I would expect to have happen here. But we have the effect of that scene having had happened. Utena convinces Anthe to go for the outside world, to face her trauma, to try and overcome. But we're flipping back and forth between these two symbols and the actual stuff that's going on. Imagine it this way. Utena did share with Anthe everything that went on in the elevator with Toga and coming to that realization. But Anthe only saw that as Utena manifesting as a vehicle. And this is why I think this part is a bit hard to understand for a lot of people, is because they're playing so fast and loose with the metaphors and with the perception of reality. And that's something that Ikahara loves to do in Utena in particular. I think he does it the most in Utena. Even in the series, you're never quite sure if what's shown on screen is actually happening or not. Sometimes you're pretty sure it's not, like when Utena's boxing a kangaroo or something. And then one of the only times you're sure that you're looking at reality is Anthe's suicide scene. So think of Anthe's revelation of her pain as doused in all this metaphor and drenched in it, with videotapes, with the gashes that don't actually exist, with giant duels in a rose garden that can't actually hold up its own weight, with a sword magically drawn from her breast. And think of Utena's revelation of her pain as simply crying on Anthe's lap and explaining Toga or what happened with Toga. We're seeing a picture in her closet. Again, we wind up at this idea that Anthe created all this glamour, all this befuddlement as a coping mechanism, which kind of goes back to her idea as a witch. And now consider Utena's resolution of her inner turmoil and conflict as simply talking it out, of literally describing it on screen, of saying, "Thank you, Toga, you were my prince. There never was a prince," literally saying it and then showing it simply just between the characters talking, even if Toga is imagined in her mind. And consider the same exact thing, Anthe overcoming her issues, as this incredibly blown out, glamorous escape sequence. True to their personalities, Utena is straightforward straightforward and honest. Anthe is closeted and mysterious. Now, I only really gushed in the Dance of Utena and Anthe because it affects me so emotionally. But I want to tell you that everything that goes on here, everything that we just talked about for the previous 15 minutes, that is genius level visual storytelling. By whatever metrics you want to go by, it can certainly be a bit off-putting, but those subtle differences between Utena and Anthe and how they cope with their pain, the visual metaphor of the key in the car and everything pointing towards the bottom left, everything with the transformation and everything is impeccable. Everything that we just said there is the reason why when people say, oh, it's Kunihika Ikahara, it has this weight to it. Because the average anime, the average storytelling doesn't think about things on this level of, visual metaphor, but also lacks the ambition and the creativity and the willpower to see something like this through all the way. And even something that tries to be a bit different or unique or interesting, like the Monogatari franchise, can fall short of it in execution. Not only is it purposeful, it's powerful, it's concise, but it's also interesting. And Ikahara's unique mix of confusion with straightforwardness and ambiguity about what's actually going on is kind of the hallmark of why I love his directing style. Alright, let's keep on keeping on here to the reveal of the Mission Control Center. If you've seen any of Ikahara's other works, the repeated symbols all over the screen, kind of this checkerboard pattern, is definitely a big Ikahara thing that he loves to do, as is the silhouette aesthetic. I really love the transition sequence, as it's like a gated door opening and kind of like an Evangelion type aesthetic, and you get Iko and Fko revealed as kind of the announcers of this part of the story. It's those two symbols plus the introduction of all these pink-haired silhouette figures that make me feel that this is kind of symbolic of inside Anthe's mind, or maybe perhaps a mix of Utena cheering on Anthe in some way. Iko and Fko, remember, we know as Utena and Anthe, but is that Utena and Anthe as representations of their conscious selves, or, Anthe's representation of Utena and her inner conscious? The word kage that features on screen is a word for meaning reflection or image or shadow or silhouette or figure or shape, something like that, kind of an outline. So if this is internal to Anthe, are there a bunch of Utena personifications inside of her mind helping her? I don't know, something like a representation of all the times Utena has aided Anthe? Either way, Utena and Anthe together are Anthe's guide through this. And I don't know anything about like mental instability, but this seems kind of like a psychosis thing, or like a, somebody who's having trouble differentiating reality from fiction would need this type of guide. Or rather, if they get a guide, they would think about it or contextualize it in this type of way. If you're contextualizing your overcoming of your issues as a giant chase sequence, you'd personify the helpers along the way as kind of shadows in your mind. Perhaps that's all just to say I think this works. And if the radio announcers are in our head, then we can kind of think of their dialogue back and forth of, doubts that she's having. Of course, she's the only person in the lead because she's the only car there, but she would necessarily need the conflict. Or perhaps need is too strong of a word, but she's definitely aware of the conflict that this is going to be and how it's going to be extra personal to herself. I think the shot composition on this part isn't anything we have to take frame by frame, but I think it's very good and very functional. Consider the mirror tilt back to Shiori to give it kind of an action movie vibe, and then the wipe using Shiori's license plate mounted on the front to cut this here. It can be very absurd in Ikahara shows, but it's also very clear, like Shiori's coming, and the direction makes it so you can clearly understand this. And it's also, kind of stupid funny in a couple ways, and that really helps the tone of this. We talked about Ikahara's comedic timings before now, but here you add this bit of levity here to know that Shiori is not actually that big of a threat. That's what this setup does here with the speeds. The information itself that she's fast doesn't discount her at all, but the way it's presented makes it hilarious. And that's very much echoed with her later on, bumping into the cones and running off the road. This isn't tense for us as a viewer because of this comedy, and it shouldn't be tense for Anthe either, even though she does, kind of action movie star it up and, take it seriously. And while it obviously functions for the metaphor to tell us a little bit more about what the cars are and what they mean, her line about, it's a mistake to think you're the only one who could turn into a car falls right in line with everything we just said about her being comedic relief, even though she's a villain. Just a quick aside aside, I don't know if I mentioned this, but Shiori's name is very close to Shiroi, which means white in Japanese, and the contrast of making her a black car is a little joke that you probably almost miss in English. And we see very quickly and very simply how she's not the real villain, how her single-eyed, myopic view of only wanting herself to escape gets her distracted and ergo destroyed. And what a brilliant little payback for everything about her character, of everything that, you know, Anthe was so worried about in the rest of the movie, that it's just not an issue. Like, it's not even a thing. And all that bullshit that went on there of, can we hide our inner trauma from Shiori, and will she expose us, and everything there, it was all so easy to just blow past her and completely ignore her. And it says so much for what Ikahara says about those people in your life, about, you know, this way to leave Otri Academy is, you know, the values Ikahara wants to manifest and expose as true to life. And that's so poignant and so simple a message, but so hard of a thing for Anthe to do outside of placing things in this type of context, when she can recontextualize Shiori as this nothingness, this bump in the road, literally. And sure, one hater is easy enough to avoid, but what happens when society gangs up on you, when you're fighting a mob, right? Not sure about this cut right here, where they go to the Kage vegetable scanner and we get celery and pecans and carrots, and then a danger sign. I'm allergic to all of those, so it may be an allergy thing that is equating the danger of society rebelling against you and trying to keep you down with the danger of having an allergic reaction. There's no information that I can find in English about Ikahara having an allergic reaction to the same things that I'm allergic to. And I don't necessarily see any pun or anything that could come up with the Japanese line on that scene, nor does Ikahara mention it in the director's commentary. Maybe it doesn't have an allergic context at all, and it was just 3 random vegetables / nuts that Ikahara came up with, so the danger of the pack is even less than all of those. Either way, I think the really poignant scene here is when the rest of society, who are people transformed into cars, who are bent on other people, you know, bringing other people down and stopping Anthe from achieving her self-actualization, they blow right by Shiori and, you know, trample her license plate and zoom right by her, crashing and burning there on the side of the road without trying to help in any way. And, you know, it's a pretty obvious commentary, right? It is super deep, but it says a whole lot about what is going on here. What's more, they even compared to locusts, and it's like, oh god, Ikahara, how ridiculously unsubtle can you be in decoding the metaphor here? And I think you guys, anybody could really take over here and tell us what this is supposed to mean with all of that background cleared up. These black cars, the other people are all out to bring you down or get in your way, and there's going to be some damage. Yeah, you're going to take scrapes, and they're going to try and get at you, and they're going to make it think like you can't continue, you can't do this. And Anthe, as we've established, is frail. She doesn't have the willpower to do it all on her own. The tunnel is obviously a metaphor for when she's alone from Utena, or when she's alone from those positive reinforcement feelings, or, you know, whatever it is that is helping her get through it. And then, but of course, it's not just Utena who's on her side, but of course Juri and Miki and Seonji, who are on the same path as her and are actually good people that will help the other person who's in need. And maybe they're a little further along on their path, but they'll gladly give assistance to people behind them. And I appreciated that while they could be represented by cars here, that Wakaba is the car, giving them the impression that they're all helped out by Wakaba and what she does. And there's a brief reprieve here in the intensity of the music too that, you know, signifies that as well. I mean, it's an obvious symbol. Like, this is very easy to describe. It's very straightforward in the metaphor. I think even when you're watching this through the first time, you get that, oh, Shiori was kind of a bad person and didn't want Anthe to escape, but these guys are cool and they helped Anthe escape. And you would think this corny line of friendship saves the day would kind of be a throwaway or cheesy, but it's not. It's crucial to what's happening. And also too, it feels like a real callback to the last movie Ikahara directed, which is Sailor Moon the R movie, Academy, which has a scene of this whole thing of like, no, she supported us, so we're going to support her in her time of need. And it's very much what happens here. And of course, as we talked about earlier, Juri and Mickey and Seonji even are on the progress, on the way there, and Wakaba too, are on the way to salvation or escaping O3 Academy or on the outside world. They're just not, it's not their story, right? Or they're not ready to face what they have to deal with yet, but they're on the path and they know the path. So it's kind of this inspiring message of, you know, even if you're not ready to face your journey yet, you'll get there with the help of the people around you. And that aid and assistance from true friends is worth far more than the entire society trying to bring you down and, you know, isolating you and putting you alone, because that breaks through it. It overcomes that, because it literally did here. Also, I just fucking love the idea of Wakaba as a cheap. I don't know, it just seems so perfect to me, right? Like if all the villainous cars or the petty people that try and bring people down are all kind of the same and all stylized as evil black horses, then Wakaba, even though she shares the same faults as a lot of people stuck in O3 Academy, she stands out in that way anyway, but she's very plain, but she's very useful and very tenacious. So I like Wakaba as a character, that's all. There's a line of dialogue here when Anthy mentions the exit to the outside world, and she communicates directly with Iko and Efko, and Iko says, not that we've seen it ourselves. So maybe that's a little more credence that it is Utena and Anthy going together to the outside world, and it's not like right as Utena finished her issues with Toga, she then ascended past the need to escape O3 Academy because she'd already escaped in that act of realizing her trauma, but more that Anthy and Utena are experiencing this together. I'm not sure there's a real interpretation either way, or that the symbols are as clear-cut as to determine all that. It could just be Iko and Efko being a representation of Utena and Anthy, and that's why she would think Utena hasn't seen it yet. I don't know, it's too muddy, I don't want to go there. But holy moly, the Castle of Eternity in this scene. Now, we talked a lot before about the Castle of Eternity and how it's very closely associated with Anthy and her construction and a willingness to engage in the idea of the prince, and indeed to Shanghai and corrupt other people into it as well. So it's fitting that it makes an appearance here in this scene, but first, let's talk about the shots here. I love how the camera remains steady as the bottom right is filled by the Utena car, and then it creeps up on him. A giant freaking castle creeps up slowly. It's closer and closer, but it doesn't just become larger, it vanishes from view for a second, which kind of symbolizes it's an illusion for her and she can put it out of her mind, but then it creeps up and it becomes something that can't be put out of the mind. There's these two brilliant shots here with the castle being revealed in its size and then panning out and showing how large it truly is, all while, you know, not having any motion in the scene. And just the effect of the movie lingering here for a good, 8 to 10 seconds. It instills upon the viewer even just a visceral reaction of how large and ominous this thing is. Of course, with the context of the symbol, we know it's a huge thing for Anthy, but I don't know that we've done enough lip service to how, the contrast of the speed and the action of the previous scene, and even the speed in the shot, and how it affects the largeness of the castle. At this point, you don't even know what is going on. Nothing that big can move that fast. Look at the size of those tires. Everything together with the reveal of the Castle of Eternity puts into scale how little a thing Shiori was, how nothing everybody else was, and how huge this internal creation and this self-limitation of Anthy is for her. And I think we need her reaction shot here. We need her to say, oh boy, oh god, I can't do this, her to waver. God, and another glamour shot of the severity of the castle and the brilliance of the castle. And I especially love the parallax on the road lines here. It gives the illusion of speed, but really Anthy's staying still and has to move through this obstacle. And it's always been that, right? It's always been that to escape O3 Academy, she would have to overcome this self-made limitation and truly address her issues. So any type of progress up until now has purely been nominal. So when Iko and Efko say, come back, you can still return, Anthy knows the stakes finally. finally. She has heard it, I guess, or understood it from what Utena has done for her and everything that's happened since Utena turned into a car. And the metaphorical reveal, because Anthe talks in metaphors or thinks in metaphors, of the final obstacle is clear to her now. And that's all it takes, right? That's all it takes, is knowing what you need to overcome and then having the determination and strength to be able to do it. When that determination is manifest, it's, embodied in her metaphor as, redoing Utena's car. And she's rewarded by the show with the kicker of the theme song. And she shoots off to the bottom left. This is all payday for the symbols that have been set up throughout the rest of the film. And it's also the functional triumph of the magical girl genre. Let's save that for the ending. I very much like that after Anthe's resolve is demonstrated and communicated to Iko and Efko, they switch from telling her to come back and she stops being awestruck, and they start to analyze it. They do a full scan of this problem in an effort to overcome it. A great way to use early 2000s CGI, by the way. They scan the whole model of the thing, and it's a way of attacking the issue, right? It's Anthe saying, no, I'm not going to be cowed by this. I'm going to analyze it, and I'm going to take it on as an obstacle and choose to attack it realistically. And I'm glancing over a ton of beautiful Sakuga for the wheels and everything, because there's real no thematic purpose here, right? Like, it's shown to be difficult for Anthe to navigate these issues and untie the knot of what the castle is to her. But she's committed to doing it. Like, she's made her decision. So now all the conflict is, just fancy lights and dressing. That's exactly why this part of the movie doesn't, linger too long. It doesn't last too long. So let's get to the one last final issue. Let's get to Anthe's mirror scene with her prince, like Utena just had with Toga. In some ways, this is kind of necessary, because otherwise that previous decision would be the end of the movie. So it needs to feel a bit more climactic, and it needs to be contextualized back into the idea of the prince, because the Castle of Eternity is Anthe's own construct, and while it's related to the prince, it's not tangibly identifiable as the prince. And I'll just mention it right now, like the mechanical shots on this film are so great, but I don't have it. You need to subscribe to another YouTuber to tell you all about how cool mechanic animation happens in anime. But thematically, it's the pressure here. It's trying to drag her backwards. It's crushing her. Symbols that are very easy to understand. So we've got Akio, dressed as Dios, and slowly walking backwards towards the right. It's a total cornucopia of everything we've talked about. Everything semiotically related over the entire course of the film. And he gives a very straightforward line. Like we said, Ikehara can be very forthwith when he wants to. And it's very hard to misinterpret this being the climax of the film with, the values that were espoused earlier on. That is to say, if you thought this movie was about anything other than Utena and Anthe managing to overcome their traumas together and escaping the hell that they've set themselves up for, if you thought there was some other reading of the core values of this film other than their graduation into full-fledged, actualized human beings, how can you maintain that after seeing the climax of the film? Whenever you need to understand what a show is fundamentally about, look for the core conflict and look at the final resolution and what helps them overcome. What is it about? Akio and Ikuni don't mince words here. They say stay and be a living corpse. You have to go back and play the princess. And while there's a bit of, contextualized metaphorical struggle after it, Anthe wins the day when she says, "You are no longer my prince." There's that pulse-pounding, kind of eerie, complacent beat in the background. There's a beautifully smooth voice from Akio's voice actor. And then there's the yell of, "Grant me the power to revolutionize the world." Something that really hasn't been harped on here in the movie as opposed to the series. And I think that's because it got a little muddy in the series itself. It's said in the second person imperative. There's no God in this film, no higher power, and nobody that is doing the granting to revolutionize the world. And they scream it as they break free of the social constructs of the prince. Put all of those together, nobody grants you the power, you grant you the power to destroy everything that's holding you back. That's it. it. That's the power to revolutionize the world. The other people, the social structures, the society that oppresses you, they were nothing. They were almost a blip in the radar. Your internal demons and your old way of thinking and your self-imposed restrictions, those are of course difficult, and there'll be people along the way who will help you, but ultimately it's you that needs to overcome those and realize that you need to overcome those. And then you can be free. And everything about your old life and the old way of thinking will fade into dust. You realize that it's nothing anymore to you. And of course, Akio and the castle and everything bursts into rose petals, and if I have to tell you why that symbol is used here, when the world of the prince for these two has just been destroyed, we get the big reveal, of course, that Utena and Anthy were Iko and Efko, and that their presences in there were, all straw men, or not real in some way. I take that to mean something like, who you thought you were back in Otri Academy doesn't matter, or isn't true. And the bongo drums come in and we get a fade out. Guess what the outside world is? It's fucking gray. How about that visual metaphor? It's also amorphous and kind of painterly, probably because the backgrounds are just painted and you can see the brush strokes in them. It's very low definition. But that, of course, that's what the outside world is. It's necessarily ambiguous and not black and white, not defined. That's the appeal of it. Look, there's people that failed on either side of you, It's grim, unpleasant, and confusing. And their dialogue here makes a point to show us that this is the true world. And the visuals make a point to show us that Otri Academy still exists. And people like Wakaba are still bound by it, and it's still clear and defined and has lots of whites and blacks. There's a not so subtle scene of it fading away into the background. Really gives the impression that it is not just a dream, we can't interpret it as something that didn't happen. We also cannot interpret it as, they destroyed the social structure, which, we go back to episode 3 or whenever we talked about the feminist readings, was something that we thought would possibly happen, but very clearly doesn't. I'm trying to find some other angles for the ending here. Iko and Efko do have a line, so it kind of implies that they're still around, or because they're still the consciousnesses of Utena and Anthy, or just Anthy, or whatever we decided on. Utena and Anthy are still going fast. They're still going very fast to the left, top left, and bottom left. And they're naked, which is very clearly read as without anything that would hide their secrets away, because they've completely bared themselves to each other. Very kill a kill. And they embrace and kiss, which remember we said was in contrast to the kind of assumed sexuality of the prince and the princesses back in Otri. This is clearly a very genuine and honest and passionate kiss. Maybe in some way it's kind of transgressive, and Ikuni just throwing up the middle finger at everybody who would take offense at having two women kissing, but I think that kind of does a disservice to how much the movie earned this kiss, and how much these two people helped each other escape from their inner demons, and this kiss is the manifestation of how much they've come to value each other. Also note that their hair has grown to the full length again. I don't know that that's anything more than Ikuni really wanting the nice shot and the color contrast of the bright neon pink and purple against the gray, and the visual metaphor that goes along with them spreading color into the world. But we do note that when they both danced amongst the roses in the dance scene, they had full length hair. And actually, I totally missed this, but Utena gets full length hair after Anthy reveals her inner trauma to her. I wonder why that is. I don't really have a good reading on that. If you can interpret Utena's hair length throughout the movie, leave a comment below, because I'm not actually quite sure. And just to finish up on the final swell, the Castle of Eternity is wiped away, and then a blue sky with white clouds and sun shining down is shown instead. A bit more on the ending. I generally prefer Adolescence of Utena to the series of Revolutionary Girl Utena, and for two reasons. One, because it's more concise. Two, because it's more clear. And I think nowhere is that more obvious than in the ending. Compared to the series ending, where you're not sure if Utena lives or dies, you're not sure what really was metaphorical, and the last act between the pair was Utena reaching into the coffin to try and bring Anthy out, even though Anthy had just betrayed Utena. I think both the series and the movie end in the same way. Utena is removed from the world of Otri Academy forcefully, but she's done enough to inspire Anthy to leave as well. Igahara absolutely loves ambiguity, so I'm sure he kind of came up with an ending for the series that would really, make it mysterious as to the fate of Utena and Anthy. Here, though, he has a chance to give you the same ending, give you the same ambiguity, but he doesn't. Why is that? I think it's because a lot of people missed the message or misinterpreted the ending to Revolutionary Girl Utena. This is kind of the patch version 2.0 to the story of Utena. The idea is the same, from the characters to the mechanics of the social structure in what Utena and Anthe are leaving behind. But here you can't miss the theme. And this is what I wanted to talk about in relation to the genre of magical girls. And it's what I want to talk about in relation to the rest of the works of Kunihiko Ikuhara. And I'm going to go back to this revealing quote that I know I mentioned probably in the first video. And this is an interview with Ikuhara that was published along with the Laserdisc release. Some quotes. Utena is someone I wish I could be. I want to be a fool. I want to be ignorant. I want to be naive. Anthe is, to me, the embodiment of reality. That's really just talking about the characters' functions and personalities and how they clash. He later goes on to say, I think my generation, as well as the younger generation, lacks imagination. You know that a great many students commit suicide. I think they're unable to imagine a happy future. To put it more bluntly, they look at their mothers and their fathers who should be motivating them for the future. They can't imagine that they will grow up to be happy. The grown-ups they communicate with are their parents, their teachers, and the like. But looking at them, they can never be convinced that their future will be happy. I don't think that's because of their parents, but because of their lack of imagination. This may apply to me too, though. I'm not so sure if I can portray this very well towards the audience, but through this, you may be able to imagine a happy future. Or through this, you might be able to go on living happily. Or these are the sorts of things I wish to portray. To put it nicely, this is why Utena is naive and foolish. She speaks of her prince and the like at her age. To our sensibilities, we think of that as stupid. I want to show that this sensibility of ours that leads us to think of that as stupid is itself absurd. This is Ikuhara legitimizing his entire work history. This is Ikuhara telling you why he makes art. And this is why there's no unhappy ending to the series of Revolutionary Girl Utena. This is why it's refined for the Adolescence of Utena. Because even through all the sorrow and all the strife, your values of compassion, understanding other people, having faith in them, loving them, and hoping that that will create a better future. That is powerful, not just in fiction, but in your lives. Don't write that off as magical girl Care Bear bullshit. That's the only thing that matters. There's 80 minutes that we just watched of some of the most confusing and hard to interpret symbols in all of anime, but the final message is so incredibly clear. It's not about Akio, it's not about Toga, and very much kind of not about the other characters in the show. How do Utena and Anthe come together to discover these values within each other in their relationship and then manifest it onto the world and onto their issues to overcome them and rise above them? And how can you take what happened to them and assume onto yourself Utena's nobility and high goals and Anthe's compassion and appreciation of Utena? Can you love somebody like Utena and Anthe love each other? Can you trust in these seemingly stupid values enough to expose yourself, to let yourself be hurt, and then overcome that and be a better and stronger person? It's a powerful movie with a powerful worldview, and it's art that deserves to be shared and deserves to be made. The Adolescence of Utena is an almost religious work that very cleanly and efficiently, if convolutedly, conveys its core values. There's so many things to like here about this film, but for me it's always been the efficacy by which it delivers on its purpose that makes this one of my top anime movies of all time. With almost unparalleled creativity and a ton of purpose behind it, I have a hard time considering it anything other than a modern masterpiece. So anyway, thanks for sticking with me as we went through almost everything that I could possibly think of to talk about in the Adolescence of Utena. It really does mean the world to me if you find some value in the ideas that I'm sharing, and I hope to in the future continue to do stuff like this for works that have similar depth. I do want to finish before the year 2020 comes a list of my top 10 anime of the decade. And while we can't do 4 hours for each of those, I'm still going to try and get about half an hour describing exactly what the show does and how it goes about doing it effectively. Anyway, once again, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed breaking down the Adolescence of Utena.